This is not a normal policy. I don't understand intellectually how anybody can get to the place that the current American negotiating team is vis-a-vis Iran. We are the only ones who are enabling them today to march towards a nuclear weapon. This is on us, not on them.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We have an important interview for you today with Aryeh Lightstone, one of the members of the Trump administration's diplomatic team that brought the Abraham Accords into existence. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And now to today's program. At this stage, it's likely that not even those American diplomats most immersed in the ongoing nuclear talks between the United States and Iran know what the outcome of their efforts will be. For the last 20 months, since President Joe Biden was sworn into office, the expectation has been that Tehran will sooner or later agree to re-enter the weak nuclear accord it concluded with the administration of former President Barack Obama in 2015. But as they did during the 2-year lead-up to that disastrous accord, the Iranians are clearly having too much fun making their American counterparts sweat to agree to the advantageous terms that everyone knows that Biden's foreign policy team has been offering to them. Yet, if, as most observers still believe, a nuclear deal is reached, it will set up a new and potentially divisive chapter in U.S.-Israel relations. That will be true whether it is the Israeli government is led after the November Knesset election by current Prime Minister Yair Lapid or his rival for power, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Unless the diplomatic effort being pursued by Biden and the Democrats is thwarted by Iranian intransigence, it will set in motion a series of events that could, assurances to the contrary being made by both countries, lead to a situation in which past assumptions about the alliance will be thrown to the winds. Such a scenario will be bad for both Israel and the United States, not least because a nuclear Iran, which is more or less guaranteed to eventually be the result of a new deal, will undermine both nations' security and undermine alliances in the Arab world. The most frustrating aspect of all this is that it could potentially undo so much of the good that was done to the region by the Abraham Accords that brought normalization of relations between Israel and important elements in the Arab world. If that happens, it will be because the Biden administration will choose ideology and false assumptions about Israel and the Islamic world over realism, and will return to a policy that isn't based on the understanding that alliances work best when all sides to it are pursuing their own best interests. The Iranians believe, with good reason, that time is on their side. Given the pressure from the Europeans to get Iranian oil flowing at a time of shortages caused by the sanctions on Russia because of its war with Ukraine, few doubt that sooner or later the Americans will agree to some sort of compromise that will finally end this dispiriting example of weakness. Though the administration continues to tell Israel that it won't tie its hands in efforts to deal with the Iranian threat, that is utterly disingenuous. Any Israeli effort to attack Iran after an agreement will place it in a direct confrontation with Washington. That will lead to incalculable complications for relations between the two allies. Indeed, given the hostility to Israel on the part of the base of the Democratic Party to which Biden is beholden, there is no telling what will result if either Lapid or Netanyahu take such a course. And even if they don't, the undermining of Israeli security by such a deal will inevitably lead to scenarios in which terrorist groups, funded and directed by Iran, will seek to take advantage with new confrontations and an upsurge in Palestinian terrorism. All this has the potential to overturn the progress made toward peace under the Trump administration and the Abraham Accords it sponsored. Just as Iran appeasement is the inevitable result of a return to power on the part of the foreign policy establishment that Biden has reinstated, former President Donald Trump's success was the product of his handing over the problem to amateurs. That team of diplomatic novices, including presidential senior advisor / son-in-law Jared Kushner, David Friedman, the ambassador to Israel, Middle East envoy Jason Greenblatt, and Friedman's aide Aryeh Lightstone, was not hindered by the establishment's almost religious belief in a peace process for its own sake and the myths that pressuring Israel was the key to peace as well as solving other problems. They wanted a policy that put America's interests first and comprehended that allowing other countries to do the same would provide a more stable and surer path to a better outcome. Biden, like Obama, treats Israel like a client state that should be compelled to agree to concessions to the Palestinians and acquiesce to appeasement of Iran because that fits in with some grand ideological construct about the Middle East that has little connection to reality. Biden is equally unrealistic about Arab nations pursuing their self-interest by allying themselves to an Israel that is an economic window to the West as well as a bulwark for their security against Iran. Many in both the United States and Israel are anxious to downplay the impact on the alliance of a new deal that will lead to a nuclear Iran by the end of the decade. The implication of Obama's appeasements were, though profoundly serious, still something that would occur in what then seemed like the distant future. But that is not true of a new agreement that will also expire while ignoring the danger from Iranian missile building and funding of terrorism. The next such boost given the Iranian regime in terms of enrichment and empowerment will place in jeopardy not just existing alliances, but remove some of the guardrails that could operate to deter escalations in violence. Though Biden apologists wrongly blame the current peril on Trump's decision to withdraw from the original deal, he was right to junk it sooner rather than later and push for a necessary renegotiation that would end rather than perpetuate the nuclear threat. That kind of realism is out of fashion in Washington these days, as the old establishment of career diplomats, think tank operatives, academics, and journalists who cling to the failed assumptions that were the foundation of American Middle East policy in the past are back in the driver's seat. If the alliance between Israel and the United States is to be saved from Biden's Iran folly, it will actually require a return to the Trump-era understandings about national self-interest and discarding magical thinking about both Iran and the Palestinians. Whether such a turnabout can happen in time to prevent the chaos and possible horror implicit in the appeasement of Iran remains to be seen. And now to today's interview. The people best placed to understand what's going wrong with the U.S.-Israel relationship right now are those who steered it in the right direction under the previous administration. Aryeh Lightstone served as the senior advisor to U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman from 2017 to 2021. In that role, he was an integral member of the Peace to Prosperity team, leading the inaugural Abraham Accords Business Summit, directing the Abraham Fund, and serving as point person in the Middle East for the actualization of the Accords. An ordained rabbi who served as a New York director of the National Conference of Synagogue Youth, he is the author of Let My People Know, the incredible story of Middle East peace and what lies ahead, a memoir of his diplomatic experience. Rabbi Aryeh Lightstone, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you very much. We're happy to have you. I want to start by asking you a question that you deal with in your book, which also has, I think, particular resonance now in this particular moment in American political history. And that has to do with the perennial conflict between political appointees and government bureaucrats, foreign service officers, and those in the intelligence establishment. In your book, you speak of many positive experiences with great people that you worked with, but also the resistance from them, especially about the opposition on the part of many of them to some of former President Trump's policies on Israel and the Middle East. In fact, you say, specifically in the book, that some of the embassy staff viewed both you and Ambassador Friedman as if you were summer interns whose temporary presence had to be merely tolerated. So first, how much of a hindrance was the permanent bureaucracy, or some term it the deep state, to implementing some of the historic changes you were a part of? And do you understand why so many people now distrust the permanent bureaucracy and intelligence establishment? And in the context of things like the whole Russia collusion hoax that really dominated the first parts of Trump's administration, and now the raid on his home. So,
okay, I don't know how much time we have for this particular podcast, but part one and part two may cover us for several weeks. To be specific, look, there's the big things and there's the small things. The things that David Friedman was able to go directly to the President of the United States of America on, he was able to steamroll through that bureaucracy as best as anybody who's ever served as an ambassador could possibly do. Because when you get a direct order from the president, that's a direct order from the president. And even at least where we sat, where the bureaucracy or the swamp or the deep state wanted to resist that, it was very difficult for them to do so. So on all of the clear actions that Ambassador Friedman was able to do specifically because of his relationship with the president, there was resistance, but we'll call it noise as opposed to actual effectiveness. When it came to the stuff at my level, which is how do I do the blocking and tackling, so there were two different ways to plow through that. Way number one was Ambassador Friedman gave me enormous latitude to be his gatekeeper. So therefore, people understood that when I was doing something, it was on behalf of Ambassador Friedman, and that in an embassy is like getting it from the president. So when I was able to roll in that direction, again, it was noise and it was annoying, but it was not an obstacle that prevented us from getting activities done. But where there were situations where it was a project that Ambassador Friedman was not meaningfully engaged with, where I did not have the full enthusiasm or blessing, not because I would ever go against him, but it was something that was sort of a additional project. So additional projects were not able to be achieved. And because of that, I stopped doing additional projects and then became sort of a full force multiplier purely of what Ambassador Friedman was there to get done, and that we were able to get done to plow through that. Your second question, or the second part of that question, which is how much trust should we have? Let me answer it as the following way. Rather than look at the swamp or the deep state bureaucracy, look at the NGOs, which I spent a lot of time talking about in the book. There's this groupthink that happens. And anytime you've got groupthink, you wind up with enormous danger. There are conclusions, and they build facts in order to establish that conclusion. I would argue that's where we're at today in terms of political persecution or political prosecution. People have come to conclusions, and now are building facts in terms of how they want to get there. How many DAs ran on the fact that they want to prosecute the Trump family or President Trump? And they were elected. I don't know how a citizen of this country can vote for anybody who's looking to prosecute or persecute a person rather than a crime. If a crime was committed, crime should be pursued. To pursue a person, that's a banana republic, and that's dangerous, and that makes us all a victim of groupthink. I'd like to think that none of us actually want to be a part of that, and we all need to take a step back and to see where we're dangerously careening towards.
You speak a lot in the book about NGOs and about how they, they inform the whole foreign policy establishment, and how they just sort of regurgitate those same points that some of these groups, which sort of masquerade as human rights organizations, but which are deeply prejudiced against Israel, they have a real impact on policy, don't they?
An enormous impact. And one of the things that's interesting, and I don't believe most of your listeners probably know, the U.S. State Department will send foreign service officers to a location, be it Jerusalem, be it Tel Aviv, be it Amman, be it Saudi, doesn't matter. And they'll send them there on what's called a rotation. And they'll be there for 3 years, maximum 4 years, and then they rotate. And most embassies rotate a third of their staff every year, because that's how you get to the, one third, one third, one third. So the person with the greatest amount of seniority has been on the ground for 3 years. Who are their contacts in these countries? You take somebody from Iowa who's never been to Israel before, trained in the Foreign Service School Department. They speak Hebrew well, and they show up in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, and they meet people. Who do they meet? They meet the people that their predecessor introduced them to. So who's there? Who's reaching out to American Foreign Service officers? It's the NGOs. Those NGOs are there not for 3 years, not for 5 years, but for decades, and they ipso facto become the brains of the State Department, because they're the ones who take the person around in Tel Aviv for the first time. They introduce them to all the people who are in the know, and you get introduced to that echo chamber. And once you're part of that echo chamber, it's extremely difficult to extricate yourself from that echo chamber. And therefore, they wind up creating policy, which is crazy.
Yeah, let me circle back to my previous question, which is sort of about, sort of the permanent bureaucracy and the intelligence establishment. How much impact are these really anti-Israel NGOs having on what sort of institutions that that probably most ordinary Americans think are purely interested in American interests, and sort of CIA, whatever, the various intelligence groups, they're being influenced by them, aren't they?
Yeah, they're enormously influenced everywhere from our intelligence organizations to our soft power organizations, because all intelligence is, soft power or hard power or secretive, is amount of information that flows in. And sometimes you win based upon quality, oftentimes you win based upon quantity. And the NGO game has figured out how to just completely and totally inundate the U.S. system with boom, 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 all of these pieces of information that all corroborate each other, even if none of them are independently corroborated. So you'll wind up with this non-virtuous circle where the NGO will give a report, the State Department will quote that report, and then an intelligence official will cite the State Department's report, and then the NGO will now quote the intelligence when they come out with their next report. And next thing you have is a U.S.-based, U.S.-blessed perspective on the Middle East, normally on the Palestinians, on the Israelis who are committing horrific war crimes or whatever else it would be, and that then gets quoted by our government and then by NGOs who now quote our government, and therefore it becomes sort of part of the legend and the lore, and unfortunately part of the information that people use to make policy, which is disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, you speak of, sort of your efforts. Ambassador Friedman has written about this as well. How much impact, did your ability to sort of speak from a different frame of reference, to bring a different perspective than sort of the Foreign Service officers or the intelligence people were used to hearing, how much impact do you think you had on them, just from the sheer novelty of it, or were they just dismissing you as, the summer interns?
Well, so I think that part actually has two different answers to it. I think had I given everybody the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, we likely could have begun our conversations better after we realized we just saw the world completely and totally differently. I come from the world which is much more realistic, and they come from a world which is much more idealistic. The opportunities that they wanted to achieve are fantastic, but my daughter also thinks that there's going to be a unicorn who's going to deliver $2 because she lost a tooth yesterday. Now, she'll get $2 under her pillow, but it isn't coming from a unicorn, right? There are practical things. You've got just the rubber hits the road with the president's PA, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, right? This great believer in peace, according to our U.S. State Department, stood in Germany and accused Israel of creating 50 Holocausts. Abu Mazen, who there's reasonable intelligence and documents who demonstrate that he was part of the financing of the Munich massacre, right, is able to stand in Germany and to go ahead and to accuse Israel of creating 50 Holocausts, and there's no meaningful repudiation. Not only is there no more meaningful repudiation, we, the United States of America, explained to Israel, stop invading, quote, invading the West Bank because you're disrupting the sovereignty or the ability for the peaceful partners, the PA, to be able to run their shop over there. It's completely and totally divorced from reality. These become terror cells. It's run by a thug whose wealthiest people in the PA are his kids, and somehow we treat this person as though he's a peacemaker, and then people throw out lines like, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And because that slogan is a lovely sounding slogan, so anybody who calls a boss what he is, which is a thug, suddenly is somebody who's not interested in saying peace and not interested in saying harmony. And these slogans tend to win the day when facts are considered secondary.
Yeah, that was a big change during the Trump administration, because there was an attempt to hold Abbas and the Palestinian Authority accountable. Where is that now? I mean, we're going to do a lot of update questions, as we go along. But I mean, there seemed to be a sense, certainly, as much as the Palestinians did not react well at all to that. As I think you write in the book, they were just their response to efforts to be held accountable, which is to say, let's hope Trump doesn't get reelected so we don't have to deal with this anymore. But, did they sort of win that point because Trump wasn't reelected, and, they're just going on as usual, business as usual, aren't they?
It is business sort of as usual. One of the differences, obviously, is in terms of how the rest of the Arab states view these people. I don't think that they view them as true leaders of the Palestinian people. I want to be very clear about this. The Palestinian people deserve a better life. How that comes about after 70 years of trying to indoctrinate them in hatred, I don't know. I mean, it's not something where you can turn a switch tomorrow and there's going to be a lot of singing of Kumbaya and they're going to be part of the tech sector, and it's going to be this is an issue. This is a very real issue that the world needs to confront, but we're not going to succeed in confronting it by pandering to them. There's a basic principle that we need to follow through. Republican or Democrat, Trump or Biden or who the heck cares, needs to stand up and say, if you continue to pay people to kill Jews, you are not part of the community of nations. If you continue to indoctrinate your kids, your students, to hate Jews, you are not a partner for peace. And as the rest of the countries show up for peace, these Palestinians are going to have a choice. Do they want to follow their leaders, or do they want to follow the region? They'll want to follow the region. They absolutely will, but it's not going to happen like this. It just can't happen like the snap of a finger. There's going to be time. There are people, when you grow up hating somebody that much, it might be their kids who will ultimately benefit. But I don't know whether I said this in the book or not, but I think it's incredibly true. Why did Guatemala move their embassy 2 days after we moved our embassy to Jerusalem? Guatemala did so because they want what is special from Israel. Israel has, now it has some natural resources, but realistically had no natural resources. Certainly didn't become the superpower that it became based upon anything in the ground or in the sea. They did it based upon human capital and ingenuity and creativity. Guatemala says, look, I've got the same situation. How do I get a tenth of that, a hundredth of that, and a thousandth of that? And if by getting closer to Israel, I get closer to the U.S. and closer to Israel, and I benefit my country, that's a major win. And they look at the Palestinians who are sitting right next to and sometimes immersed within Israel, and they refuse to face reality and instead are just married to their narrative and miss out on all the advancements that they can possibly have. They just look and say, look, you've missed the boat. And they see that in Abu Dhabi, and they see that in Bahrain, and they see that in Morocco. It's not that they don't feel for the people, they do. I think that there's a discouragement or disappointment in the so-called leaders of the Palestinian Authority, and I don't think that they'll ever come back from that. That's a good thing.
Yeah, but I want to relate that also to something that's going on in the United States, in that we have increasingly a willingness to tolerate anti-Semitism from the left, whether it's coming on the pages of the New York Times or from members of Congress, which is disguised as sort of quote-unquote criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism, but which boils down to the same kind of hate that the Palestinian Authority has been inculcating into its people and getting away with. How are we ever going to convince them to change if so much of the establishment in this country is not taking seriously the same kind of questions when it comes to anti-Semitism here?
Right. So we've got two different ways. We can go the way that we've gone in the past, which is if you just give them a little bit more, they'll be happy with what they've got. Or you can be strong and principled on what we have. And for example, when they had the condemnation of Ilhan Omar, which condemned everybody and everything, that's not a condemnation. that
Yeah,
doesn't
rather
count.
than just her specific
Correct.
anti-Semitism, it was turned into a
Correct.
laundry list of things that even she voted for
Correct.
because she wasn't named in it as well.
Right. And it is our failure to be proud about this. Look, I learned this from David Friedman, and I said this very early on in my book. I'm a pretty proud American. I'm a very proud Zionist as well. I was concerned about me coming into the administration because I was going to be perceived as being too pro-Israel. And David taught me very quickly that that's not called pro-Israel. That's called pro-America. And we have people who are not advocating for America. The things that they're advocating for are asinine, and they need to be called out for that. Now, are we going to win one argument? Likely not. Are we going to win a series of arguments? Also likely not. But we need to stand strong with what we know to be true. And I hate to use this phrase, but the arc of history is going to prove us right. The Abraham Accords, right, demonstrated all the people in our embassy who thought that we were summer interns came along and said, wait, those guys are onto something. I don't know if they're bragging about it today working in the State Department, but they wanted to be on every first flight. They wanted to host every delegation because it's exciting to see the breakthroughs happen. And when the reason why I wrote Let My People Know, I could have just written about the Abraham Accords because I was there on the ground witnessing the first flight, the first people. I like to describe it, Jared and Avi created peace on a piece of paper, and I was challenged amongst other people to create peace in between people. What happens when they first connect and they first meet? And that was very fantastic. I was very honored to be able to play that small role in that progress. And I could have just written about that, and frankly, it deserves its own book. But you don't get to there without understanding that we didn't get there by compromise. We got there by being principled. And that's what we have to do here in America. When Ilhan Omar, who's an anti-Semite, says anti-Semitic things, she should be called out for being an anti-Semite. When people do things that are completely and totally reprehensible, they should be called out for that, not in a way of hatred, but in a way of principle. And we should stand for our principles. Being pro-Israel is not a dual loyalty piece. It's pro-America. And I watched it in real time happen, and I'm embarrassed to tell you I learned that. And I know if I learned that, I think most of our community who is pro-Israel needs to learn that as well, hence let my people know.
Yeah, good point. One of the important points you make in your book concerns whether Israel should be allowed or to annex, or rather to extend its law into parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, that it will not give over to a putative Palestinian state in the event that a putative Palestinian state arises in the course of a peace agreement that seemingly the Palestinians don't want. And that unless, but the point that you make is that unless Israel rights there in these parts of the territories where the so-called settlements are, Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, once it's allowed to do that, the Palestinians will continue to make unrealistic demands about the 1967 borders. And ultimately, where everybody's still stuck in the same conundrum where, peace is impossible. Now, this issue led to a dispute between some in the White House, notably Jared Kushner and Ambassador Friedman and the Israeli government led by Netanyahu. And now that's kind of played out, in the recent spate of memoirs that are being published. Can you unpack the controversy as that unrolled in real time for us? And what was its ultimate significance, if any?
Yeah, and the answer is I can't, because I was not in all of those rooms. I wasn't part of all of those conversations. I will tell you of the conversations that I was in, I think that everybody is very pleased with where we wound up. And I think everybody agrees, and this is the important part, everybody agrees that there needs to be clarity in Judea and Samaria. And I think everybody agrees that there needs to be clarity defined by Israel. Israel needs not a 61-seat government, not a 59-seat government. It needs a government to deal with real issues, whether it's Iran, whether it's the economy, whether it's Haredi and Israeli Arab employments, or it's its actual own borders, right? Decide what your borders are. You have allies. Israel has a lot of allies, none more important than the United States of America. Decide what it is, make your case for it, and then bring your case at the opportune time to the court of public opinion, to the court of your allies' opinions, and go with that. This is something that I think the plan presented that said, look, don't live in this state of flux. It doesn't help anybody. If you look at not all, but much of the Israeli press today is dealing with, one second, all of the rules in Area C are applied unfairly. And depends on which press you read, well, the settlers are getting an advantage. or the Palestinians are getting advantage. What's clear is everybody is trying to take advantage because there's no clarity. So bring clarity to the area. And that's what the plan that President Trump put out tried to do, whether it was for immediate application of sovereignty or close to immediate application of sovereignty, to me, much less relevant. What's much more relevant is there should be application of sovereignty at the right time in the right way, and Israel should get there, and it should do that with its allies. And what's really interesting about that is as the Abraham Accords expand, its allies will not just be somebody sitting in Washington, D.C. or in Dallas, Texas, but its allies could actually be people from broadly around the world who will say, if this is better for the Palestinian people, ignore the Palestinian leadership for a moment, but if this is better for the people who live in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, then I think that there would be support for that. We're not there today, but I think that we need to get there.
Yeah. You speak in the book of individual Palestinians, for example, who took part in the Bahrain Economic Summit, and how sort of amazing that was, but also they were then worried about their security because Palestinian Authority was threatening them. They were sort of going against the nationalist narrative in which any normalization with Israel is pretty much a death penalty offense.
Yeah,
you sound like an optimist in your book about the future of the Palestinians, and because of sort of eventual leadership changes. But I guess my question is, what are the prospects of those, fundamental changes ever happening if the political culture and even the national identity of Palestinians is still inextricably tied to their 100-year-old Zionism, rather than a more practical state-building, frame of reference?
Yeah, maybe I would say I'm cautiously optimistic as opposed to truly optimistic. My reason for cautious optimism is the following. If you saw Abu Dhabi and Dubai 35 years ago, I don't think you would have anticipated Abu Dhabi and Dubai looking what they look like today. I think if you would see Tel Aviv and Jerusalem 35 years ago, I don't think you would have seen Tel Aviv and Jerusalem looking like they do today. I think if you, as an American, were approaching 9/11, in just a couple of days from now, if you remember and feel how the U.S. approach to Saudi was just 2 decades ago and how the U.S. approach to Saudi is today and should be, I think rooting for their success and modernization, it's 2 decades. I mean, this is not even half my lifetime. I'm embarrassed to say that I'm that old now, but I'm saying this is within one half of my lifetime, an entire major shift. If that can happen, I believe also within a half of my lifetime, we can see the Palestinians showing up and saying, I'm ready to build Singapore. I'm ready to become part of what Hong Kong used to be. I'm ready to be the bridge in between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. And I'm going to benefit. Palestinians are hardworking, creative, well-educated people who are hindered by horrendous leadership. Now, they're also hindered, and nobody talks about this, by decades of indoctrination. That doesn't go away tomorrow. It really doesn't. But you can make the same argument as you see Saudi, and you can make the same argument as you see other countries in the broader region. There's been a pivot where they want to compete for economics and prestige and not for weapons and ideology. And I hope that will happen in the Palestinian areas.
That leads me to ask, that sounds, sort of very realistic, cautious optimism. But how permanent are the Abraham Accords going to be, especially if they are not expanded? If things don't expand, they contract. That's sort of a rule of politics. And the Biden administration doesn't seem very interested in doing that. I mean, at first they didn't even want to use the term Abraham Accords. They may be okay with it now, but this certainly isn't a priority for them or anything close to it, is it? And if that's not going to happen, where do they go then?
Yeah, my concern isn't whether the Biden administration wants to support the Abraham Accords or not. My concern with the Biden administration is, do they want to give $250 billion to Iran? That's the concern. That everything else is window dressing. That is a fatally flawed policy decision that continues to be that way. The only ally that I think good people have right now is that the Iranians keep moving the goalpost. America keeps reaching them where they were, and Iran keeps asking for more. Maybe they'll run out the clock and we'll have a chance to have a normal policy vis-a-vis Iran. This is not a normal policy. I don't understand intellectually how anybody can get to the place that the current American negotiating team is vis-a-vis Iran, and that shakes things up in the region. If Iran winds up with $250 billion and then premature to have a nuclear umbrella within the next 7 to 10 years, so suddenly the leadership in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Bahrain and elsewhere now need to decide what do they think in Tehran, perhaps more than what do they think in Washington, D.C. And anytime anybody has to make a calculus based upon what crazy people are thinking, it's very difficult to be able to make normal calculations in that regard. That's what's dangerous. You ask a second question. I'm sorry for getting off on that. Anytime I can speak about the Iran.
Yeah, well, I was planning on getting to Iran later, but we can get to that sooner as well.
We can get to that. But Ambassador Friedman says so beautifully in his book. Obviously, if you're not elevating something, you're denigrating it. If you're not expanding it, it's going to get stale and it's going to contract. That's true. But the Abraham Accords don't need the U.S. in order to continue to grow them. They'd be better off if they were there, but you've got meaningful leadership in Morocco and UAE and Bahrain and Israel who are all motivated to see this work. I think every one of those leaders sees this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Nobody wants the Abraham Accords to look like the Israel-Jordanian deal, which is essentially just let's ignore each other. Everybody wants who's involved there to say, how do we bolster this? How do we support this? How do we grow this? And they're doing that. Could it go faster? Yes. Could it go bigger? Yes. And could all of that happen with the United States of America? Absolutely. But as long as you've got positive momentum going forward, I think that these accords will stay strong, and I think there will be new leadership at some point in time in the not-too-distant future. And that new leadership, I think, is going to run to the Abraham Accords on day number 1, not year number 3. I believe that what the previous administration, the Trump administration, did in terms of the Middle East piece in the past is the floor and not the ceiling. The roadmap has been laid, and I think anybody, hopefully Republican or Democrat, but certainly Republican, is going to seize that on day number 1 of his or her administration.
Yeah, well, I think that part is, at least it ought to be true. Let me drill down a little bit in terms of the Arab world. You're absolutely right. I think the leadership of the countries that have already engaged with the Abraham Accords, as well as the Saudis, who are more or less, gave it their imprimatur, even if they didn't participate themselves. But one of the criticisms that people who are critics of Israel and critics of the Abraham Accords say is that these are deals with Arab tyrannies. These are not, democratic, regimes. They're inherently unstable, or at least theoretically unstable, and that they're also dealing with public opinion. Not that sort of some of their leaders really care about public opinion in the way that American political leaders have to, or Israeli political leaders have to in a democracy, but that public opinion still in the Arab street, in the Arab world, is still deeply influenced by anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment, and that we see that sort of not just in sort of speeches at the UN, where even the UAE is, can be heard saying things which are, sort of terrible about Israel. But, how is that factored? Does that worry you? That these are sort of top-down agreements in the Arab world that may not, at least not yet, have popular support?
Of course they don't have broad popular support yet. You've got 2 years coming up this September 15th, and 14 months of that under COVID restrictions. So you have, let's call it 1 year of sort of a normalized basis with UAE, Bahrain, Israel, and Morocco. Leave aside Kosovo and Sudan for the moment. You've got 70 years or more of deep-held thoughts. I don't want to call it even resentment. I don't think that the Emiratis would tell you that there's resentment, nor the Bahrainis or the Moroccans. But certainly conflicting thoughts in between those countries.
And they feel very compelled to speak up for the Palestinians, even if they're really sick of the Palestinians and don't want to be held hostage by them anymore.
Yeah, correct. And you know who also feels compelled to that? I remember getting a phone call after the first big UN vote that UAE and Bahrain either abstained or condemned Israel. I can't remember which it was. And somebody said, ha, the Abraham Accords don't work. I said, ha, tell me please how the United States of America and Great Britain voted in that same UN vote. And they both voted with UAE and Bahrain. And I said, does that mean that the U.S. is not the greatest ally that Israel has ever had? There is a issue at the UN specifically. Let's ignore everything else for a moment, where people walk into this twilight zone where it's suddenly permitted, even great allies of Israel, it's permitted to have a conversation whether Israel does or does not have a right to exist. I've said this time and time again. I'll say it again now. I'm sick of seeing U.S. leaders tweet, Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. Israel has a moral obligation to defend itself. That's what a country is supposed to do for its citizens. The second we go ahead and say that Israel has a right, somebody else can stand and say Israel doesn't have a right. And next thing you know, we're sitting at the UN, and there's some big debate about whether Israel does or does not have a right to exist. That's baloney. And the whole UN doesn't even deserve to exist if that is a conversation that they're willing to entertain time and time again. And I don't know what it is when you walk into that building. Maybe it's part of the security pass. You lose some IQ points. I'm not positive what it is. But let's leave the UN piece aside for a moment. What I am interested in seeing is there scientific cooperation? Is there academic cooperation? Is there business cooperation? Is there tourism cooperation? And the answer is yes to all of those things. Is there enough? The answer is no. Are there plenty of Israelis going out to those countries? Yes. Are there nearly enough Moroccans, Bahrainis, and Emiratis coming into Israel? No. Is there even education or advertising to bring them into Israel? Also not. All of these things need to be improved. The Abraham Accords are in a very nascent stage. They need to be grown. They need to be nurtured. Would they be doing much better with an actively involved U.S. government? Absolutely they would be. But I want to say a second point, which you said, making peace with these countries that have monarchies, we'll call them monarchies, and not ripe democracies. We saw what happened during the Arab Spring to these countries that the U.S. government, then under President Obama, encouraged to have these broad democratic reforms. I'm yet to see any of those turn out to look a lot like Australia, the United Kingdom, or the United States of America.
Yeah, it's the Muslim Brotherhood,
correct.
Not Jeffersonian democracy.
Correct. The UAE and Bahrain have been staunch allies of the United States of America with their leadership. We should support that. We should root for that, and we should help those leaders become stronger. That's absolutely what we should do. It's in our interest as Americans. When you look at Morocco, something that's not well known is that the election they had, let's call it 10 months ago, to the best of my knowledge, is the first time in the history of the Arab or Muslim world where the Muslim Brotherhood was voted out of power, right? If you remember the Gaza war in May of 2021, you saw the Prime Minister of Morocco tweeting his support for Hamas. And people were like, wait, how could that be? Morocco just has peace with Israel. It's 7 months old. And the Prime Minister of Morocco is tweeting out support for Hamas. Yeah, because the Prime Minister was a member of Muslim Brotherhood, which is the same thing as Hamas. Do you know what happened to that Prime Minister? He got voted out. Now, I'm not looking for the current Prime Minister of Morocco to be tweeting congratulations to Israel for blowing up terror cells in Hamas. We're not quite ready for a 180-degree difference. But the guy, the Prime Minister in Morocco, sure as heck knows the danger that Hamas and Hezbollah give, and the people of Morocco know that difference, and they voted out the Muslim Brotherhood. And we should be celebrating that. We should have American companies running to Morocco to demonstrate that Western-facing governments should win and terror-facing governments should lose. And we're not active enough in that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. One more Abraham Accords question. You are directly involved in some of the most important aspects sort of on the ground of it, including directing the Abraham Fund, trying to really establish this as economic facts.
Yeah.
Where is the Abraham, you left that post obviously at the end of the Trump administration because you were a political appointee. Where is that fund now?
That fund does not exist. That fund, like so many of our initiatives, were canceled on January 21st, 2021 for the sole reason that President Trump thought they were a good idea. Therefore, by definition, they must be a bad idea if you're part of the Biden administration. I hope we're now almost 2 years away from that. I hope that President Biden and his administration will look and say the Abraham Accords are the single greatest thing that they've got going in foreign policy today. reopen the fund, reopen a special envoy in order to be able to grow and support the Abraham Accords. And the reason for that isn't because there's not a single dollar from the Abraham Fund was a donation. Not a single dollar was going to be charitable, which the U.S. just gives away without any requirement for return on investment in so many different places. The Middle East specifically, this is an investment fund, and the goal of the investment fund was purely to create a platform where Emiratis, Israelis, Bahrainis, Moroccans, Egyptians, Jordanians could sit at the same table. And it's easier for them to sit at my table, your table, the U.S. table, than at any of their tables. That's what being a superpower does. We get to leverage our dollars. We get to return our dollars to the taxpayers while expanding peace and prosperity for our allies throughout the region. And somehow that was not a winner for this administration. I hope that they reopen the Abraham Fund. It'll be incredibly successful. And not only will it be incredibly successful, it'll return taxpayer dollars to the taxpayer. Maybe it can pay off some student debt.
Well, that's a whole other issue, which we could spend another podcast on. But let's turn to Iran. You've already alluded to why it's so crucial. I guess what I want to focus in on is not just how terrible a return to an Iran deal that would guarantee that Iran gets a nuclear weapon rather than actually forestalling it as promised. What is the impact of a new Iran accord on the other Arab countries, that have made peace, normalized relations with Israel, and on the alliance with Israel itself? How is this going to work if, in fact, Israel is going to be thinking about overturning it in some way, if it feels it has to attack Iran at a time when the United States is pretending that the problem is solved?
Yeah, it's a big game of chicken, and a lot of people are holding their cards extremely close to their vest. And the question is whether Iran will or will not have this nuclear capability. And if they do, the entire Middle East becomes influenced by Russia, China, and Iran. That will be the superpower trifecta, which will have its tentacles everywhere from Mecca and Medina, which means influence over 1.5 billion Muslims on a daily, 5 times a day basis, and likely will set the Middle East backwards to look much more like Afghanistan and much less like the UAE. That's what happens if they get a bomb. In the meantime, every country needs their own foreign policy. America had an America First policy. I'm not positive what policy we have today, but Israel has an Israel First policy, and UAE has a UAE First policy, and Saudi, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to list all the countries. Every country now needs to make a calculation. What can they do? What should they do? And what will happen if they do or do not take any of those actions? And those actions become very calculated, and correctly so. One of the things that we learned during the Abraham Accord process, led by Jared and Avi in this case, was don't negotiate in public. If you remember, it was August 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern time. The phone call happened in between Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and President Trump, and nobody in the world knew that phone call was happening because it gave Bibi and Mohammed bin Zayed time for their own ways to create the deal and the opportunity, and then to announce that it had happened. There was no process, and I speak about this in the book also. There was just peace. The same thing with Iran. I don't think there will be a process. I think there either will be Iran with a nuclear weapon or there will not be Iran with a nuclear weapon, and each country is going to calculate and calibrate what that ultimately looks like. What we've seen is that Israel seems to be the only country in the Middle East who is willing to take meaningful steps in that direction to prevent that. Frankly, Israel is the only one that can't negotiate its own surrender. Mm-hmm. Right? I think what Golda Meir used to say, what was Israel's secret weapon? It's got nowhere else to go.
Right. Yes. Well, the Arab states, if they feel that Iran is, in the parlance of the region, the strong horse, they can make their peace with them in some way. Obviously, Israel can't.
And look who Iran is backed by. It's not just Iran. It's Iran. Russia's not invited to any place in polite company today, and correctly so, other than for the Iran deal. There's an Iran, China, Russia deal. That is the deal that should be voted on by our Congress. And when our Congress correctly rejects that, The United States of America should resume the sanctions to the highest possible level and put a credible military threat on the table. And Republicans and Democrats should stand side by side and say, this is American policy, not Republican policy, not Democratic policy. And do you know what the mullahs will do? They will surrender. They cannot resist a united America. We are the only ones who are enabling them today to march towards a nuclear weapon. This is on us, not on them.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I want to switch tracks for a moment before, in the time that we have remaining, and to ask about a slightly different angle on this. You're someone who's worked with Jewish youth in the United States. One of the great problems in the relationship between Israel and American Jewry is the disaffection among U.S. Jews, especially young Jews, towards Israel and their alienation from a nation that is routinely accused of being, falsely accused of being an apartheid state. Yeah. What's the remedy for this, and how worried are you about the future of the ties between these two very different Jewish tribes that increasingly seem to be talking past each other?
Yeah, I'm very worried. I'm not worried that they've talked past each other. I haven't looked at the statistics recently. I think that the Twitter heads talk past each other. I think that the so-called self-appointed leadership, who's the leader of the American Jewish people? I don't know who the leader of American Jewish people is. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that proud identifying Jewish kids who come from proud identifying Jewish families, who are affiliated with proud identifying Jewish communities, love the state of Israel, and the state of Israel loves them. I think that people who either don't have one or all three of those, I think then make their identity those who say, wait, you want to call me Jewish? Let me tell you what my Judaism is. My Judaism is bashing Israel. And why that becomes their Judaism, I don't know. Have some psychologists explain why that becomes somebody's identifying remark. And we've seen it throughout Jewish history. There's some form of psychosis, apparently, that we have when we have the ability to be strong and to be proud, where it's against our DNA to do that. But communities and families and people that are strong, I think, care deeply for Israel. Is Israel perfect? Absolutely not. Can Israel improve? Absolutely yes. Can we help it improve as a diaspora? Yes, that's part of our job. It's part of our opportunity. But I'll give you just one example. I was there when a group of people made Aliyah this summer. They decided to change and move their citizenship to become Israelis from America. And as I went down the line and asked several of them why, several of them told me economics, several of them told me affordability, but several of them told me when they saw last May that it's open season on anti-Semitism in LA and Chicago and New York, said, how much Jewish history do you need to learn to be able to realize that there is no such thing as a permanent safe place for the Jewish people outside of the land of Israel? And they make a good point. I do believe that America will be a permanent safe place for the Jewish people.
Yeah, you speak of the importance of American exceptionalism
correct.
In your book.
Yeah. I would make the same argument for the Jews who are disaffected with Israel. They're likely disaffected with America. That's my case.
That's very true.
Yeah,
yes.
And this is part of the college campus and the intersectionality and all of these things. We have to look at this significantly for all of our youth and figure out how we're going to make sure America is America and how Israel is Israel. And American Jews are uniquely positioned to have both of these as major challenges that they have to face.
Yeah, I think this relates to sort of broader topics, but, isn't the whole debate about critical race theory and which is, sort of a toxic, along with intersectionality, is sort of a toxic myth that delegitimizes Israel and accuses it and the Jewish people of possessing white privilege, which makes no sense in an Israeli context, especially. This plays a huge role in American Jewish opinion because it is so much a part of sort of the culture of sort of liberal American politics in which so many Jews are immersed, aren't they?
Yeah. My answer to that is come and see it. Come to Israel. Send your kids. Don't wait till college. I think college is a terribly dangerous place to be. Send your kids in middle school. Send your kids in high school. If you care about this as a parent and you don't vacation there, by definition, you don't care about this. Vote with your feet. and show Israel. Look, I was waiting in line to get a very long line to leave Israel a couple nights ago, and I was amazed by the diversity of Israelis waiting in my line. I'm like, oh, that person must be visiting from such and such a place. Nope, Israeli passport. Wait, that person definitely has to be a tourist as well. Nope, Israeli passport. I, who I think actually could pass as a traditional Israeli, was the only guy waiting in line with only an American passport. Everybody else from every color, from every gender, from every identification sat there with an Israeli passport. Israel is incredibly diverse and incredibly welcoming. And one of the things that it's got in order to build the melting pot is serving in the IDF. People disagree strongly, but at the end of the day, I think they hug each other. I say this all the time. I want to be able to hug people I disagree with. I don't want to hate them. I really don't. This is where America is devolving towards, and that's not a recipe for success for our future.
No, not at all. One of the interesting sidebars in your book is your role as a publicly observant Jew, a kippah-wearing Jew, in the public service while you were serving in the administration. Was the government and all the people in it more welcoming to a kippah wearer than you expected, or what most ordinary American Jews would expect? How did that work out?
I think, like everything else, it spanned the spectrum. There were plenty of people who were very excited. There were plenty of people who were very nervous. What I discovered after my second or third meeting with somebody, it did not matter. It mattered who I was. And this was a part of who I was. For me, it's an incredibly important part of who I was. I wish I was a better person. I think that when people meet you as sort of the person in that circumstance, if you have no flaws, I think you'll be much better off at that job. I have many flaws, as I think most of us do. And to me, my big concern was when you went someplace and you were likely the only Orthodox Jew or Orthodox rabbi that they were ever going to meet, you're like, oh my goodness, perhaps I spoke poorly about somebody at that meeting. Perhaps I cut somebody off in the process of a conversation. And when they go in with a preconceived notion, they'll think, oh, well, that's what Orthodox Jews or Orthodox rabbis do. I tried to hold myself to a higher standard. If I could do it over again, I would try even harder. I mean, it's really important.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I'll close by asking you, what was the one thing that surprised you the most about serving in your position and working, in all these in these fascinating times and on these, really profoundly important projects such as the Abraham Accords and the recognition of Jerusalem, Golan, so much was accomplished. What surprised you the most in your experiences?
How much personal relationships matter. Whether it was Ambassador Friedman's relationship with the president, Jared Kushner's relationship with Mohammed bin Zayed, all of their relationships with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Avi Berkowitz's relationship with all the influential ambassadors in Washington, D.C. When a machine tries to accomplish something, the U.S. government, and tries to do something, that's hard. Machines are difficult, right? There's a cog and there's a this, and that person's out and this doesn't. But when you pick up the phone call and there's trust and there's camaraderie and there's interest, I mean, we sat around the table countless times where it was Israelis, Emiratis, and Americans, and we used the word we, and it was unclear of who we was referring to, because we were trying to create a better region. Who was that good for? In theory, it was good for all of us. This was a win-win-win, and we were able to get to that position where when I used the word we, and I was speaking for the Emiratis, nobody pointed their finger at me and said dual loyalty, right? Which allowed me to say we when I was speaking about Israel, and also nobody pointed their finger at me and said dual loyalty. And that's why the vast majority of the time when I use the word we, obviously I was speaking about the United States of America, but the Abraham Accords was a win for all of us. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's an American issue. It's an Israeli issue. It's an Emirati issue. These are our allies, and we should care about that and we should invest in that. I wouldn't have thought that was the case. I will tell you the flip side of that. When somebody influential had a bad morning, policy was affected by that bad morning. I don't know, they spilled their coffee on the way to work or whatever.
Well, you mentioned that, I know, in your book about, whether President Trump being in a good mood, going into some of those meetings.
Read Jared's book, read David's book. The president doesn't know me. I don't know him. I was lucky enough to be in a couple of meetings with him, and I guess he's a normal human being who has good days and bad days. But I saw other people who have good days and bad days. I'm like, oh my goodness, that affects policy. And as I looked at that, I tried to look at myself. I'm like, oh, maybe I don't affect any policy, which I don't. But if I have a bad day at work, am I a worse father, right? If I have a good day at work, am I a better spouse? And I tried as hard as possible to try to separate that. The person who I think is the single greatest I've ever seen in the world, that is Jerry. You could be in a meeting where before something happened and after something's going to happen, but in that meeting, those things don't exist for him. I don't know how he does that. Incredibly moved by that. I've seen that with other people also, but I don't think anybody to that level. By definition, if I had a bad day at work, I'm assuming I was less of a good father, less of a good spouse. I've tried to work on that by watching people who are excellent at that. Interesting to have seen from the inside.
Yeah, very interesting. Rabbi Lightstone, thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you on the show and having all of your insights on these important issues, and people should read your book. We also want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or on any other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JNBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, please keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.